Welcome to the Sanskaari Girls Podcast. I'm Vandita Morarka, and today we will explore what it means to read literature in translation, particularly feminist writing from South Asia. And that's the beauty of writing in South Asia, that it's always been done in so many different languages. Today, we deep dive into how translation shapes not only access to stories, but also the way we interpret voice, nuance, and context. And I'm so excited to share who our guest is today. Our guest is Sowmya V. They're a computational linguist and acclaimed literary translator whose work sits at the fascinating intersection of technology and literature. Sowmya has translated across genres and generations, from Satyajit Ray's film essays to Kondapalli Kotteswarama's autobiography, The Sharp Knife of Memory, to her latest work, Endapalli Bharati's The Hunger That Moved a Goddess. Her translation have made feminist and politically charged Telugu texts accessible to English readers while preserving their cultural depth and linguistic richness. Alongside her literary contributions, Sowmya is a researcher in natural language processing, pioneering efforts to make Indian languages, including Telugu, part of large language model development. This dual expertise gives her a rare vantage point on both the artistry and the politics of translation. I'm so excited to speak with her today about what it means to read, write, and translate feminist texts across languages and technologies. I feel like today is additionally special because I've been having so many conversations where women in tech are missing. But someone like Sowmya shows us that women in tech are here. We just have to watch and listen and let them do their thing. So, Sowmya, welcome to the podcast. Hello.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for a very flattering introduction. Looking forward for the conversation.
Likewise, really looking forward. So, I'm going to dive right in. I started off by showing that you wear multiple hats, from a computational linguist on, developing Indian languages within large language models to being a literary translator. But I understand that translation actually happened pretty by accident for you. You started with film reviews for a Telugu website in your BTech first year, if I'm right. And how did this accidental beginning shape your approach to translation?
It happened like randomly. I was not very much. I didn't consider translation as a possibility, but like when I was in my BTech first year, like there was a writers club where I joined because I'm generally interested in writing, and one of the professors who managed this writers club somehow thought I can try translation. So there was a more left-leaning magazine called Udyamam in Telugu that was running at the time. I don't think the magazine exists now. So he suggested that I translate a few essays from English into Telugu. I don't remember what exactly did I translate. There was one from tehelka.com, which I clearly remember, but I think I did like 4 or 5 translations like that, and it stopped there. And when I was it was this period where like there were a lot of Telugu websites coming up and blogs were coming up, and I got into that world, and started writing for a Telugu film webzine called Navatarangam, where the person who founded that website, Venkat Siddhareddy, he's now a publisher. So he suggested, why don't you translate these essays from Satyajit Ray into Telugu? That's how I did it, and then a book came out of it, and I thought I'm done with these things. And I happened to meet Geeta Ramaswamy Garu of Hyderabad Book Trust at the end of 2012, I think. It was right after Kondapalli Koteswarama's Telugu autobiography got released, and it was well received. I loved it. I even gifted it to many people at the time, and I don't know why she suggested it, but she said, why don't you try to translate this into English? And that is a bit shocking because I only did academic writing in English until then. I mean, I did write some blog posts and things like that, but I don't consider myself like someone who can do that kind of stuff in English. So we just thought, let me try. I was doing my PhD in Germany at that time, so I said, okay, fine, I'll go back and let me try one chapter. And of course, I was living alone in Germany. There is nothing except academics and some friends. So I used all my free time on this one. And once that book came out, again, there was a 10-year gap. I moved on with my life, just regular things. And again, Geeta Garu again suggested, why don't you translate Bharati stories? And yeah, it didn't come naturally to me. all these book length works. They just happened because someone suggested. I did translate a few short stories on my own in between, but yeah, they are different. They just appeared in different webzines, like, and also in Outlook. Yeah, that's my history as a translator. I don't know what I'll do next.
That's beautiful. I also really love that, you've taken your time with this and you've done it in your own terms. And that's really
Yeah.
powerful to know that you can do this. Like you can do so many multiple things in your life together. I think for a lot of our listeners, that's such a powerful thing. And you mentioned Geeta. Geeta, actually, I think I'm assuming we're referring to the same Geeta. We discussed their book. They came in for an author meetup with the book club. And I have to say today, I'm so grateful that you met all of these people and they encouraged you to translate because it's opened up such a wealth of literature for the world. If I may, I'll share a quick example. Over the last 3, 4 years, I've been trying more and more to be able to read in different Indian languages. While I'm able to understand and speak in some, I'm not always able to read. And it's been a fascinating journey of finding so much activism that lies in languages outside of English. And that's completely ignored. So work like yours really helps with that. And I'm curious about, what that journey was like. You mentioned a bit of it, but you were at Osmania University in Hyderabad. And then you went on to be at the National Research Council of Canada, pursuing that interest in Telugu literature. So what were the other parts of the journey? Like what felt difficult? What was easy?
So there is a active online community in Telugu literature where you meet all sorts of people, right? Like there are people who are more like strongly ideological and pursue and consider only those kind of literature as literature, and there are people who are like writing this classical metrical poetry and things like that even today, like younger people. I'm not talking about retired people or anything, people much younger than me. So there are like all sorts of people, and there are people who are more reading, promoting or reading more conservative literature from more recent times or like 60 years ago. Like there are all sorts of people writing in Telugu online. So I don't know about print that much because I live outside and I don't have access to print stuff. So I think that is what kept me, more interested in Telugu literary world in general. And then when you read these things, and then when you also read like local authors, right? Like I read a lot of Canadian authors, like indigenous authors of Canada, who all mainly write in English because of many historical reasons. And when I read those things, and then when I think back about like all sorts of Telugu authors from different backgrounds, like there are people like from like Adivasi background who speak a different language but write in Telugu because that's the language they're educated in. So when I read in both languages, it's inevitable to think about uh, what happens if these people know about those people, right? So I think that's what keeps me engaged in that community, despite the fact that I do completely different things for a living.
So that's really powerful. And even now you've touched upon the different types of work that you've been engaged in. I'm curious what you learned. Like, when you translated different genres, different voices, were there learnings? Are there differences that you think people should know about?
Um, yeah, not as much when I did the autobiography. I mean, there were of course things, experiences themselves. They are like unique, and maybe you don't see those kind of things in say other parts of India or other parts of the world. But when I was doing the short story translations, especially Bharati's translations, there were a few things like, say, she talks a lot about these different flowers and these kind of things, or different leafy vegetables and these kind of things. Sometimes you just don't know the equivalents in English, and which I think is okay. Like, I mean, you don't have to know, like, they don't exist beyond like botanical terms, or maybe it's not that common and I just don't know. Like I think that's okay. And the sentence structure, like, and the kind of repetitions, like sometimes, say for example, in Telugu, the sentence structure may look relatively simple, or the sentences follow the same kind of thing, like everything starts with the first person me, like I did this, I did that. Like it flows well in Telugu, and then when you translate it into English, it may sound monotonous. Like an editor can come back to you and say all these sentences look monotonous. It's not. I mean, I did get this feedback actually for another story. which I submitted to a international journal, and that was their actual main feedback. Like, I mean, everything looks good, but these sentence structures, they don't make sense. I mean, they don't make sense in the sense they're not like very uh, catchy or readable. So one way, these are the kind of things that you notice as a translator, right? And for me as a reader, I'm okay with those kind of things as long as there is something new in that story, right? Like there should be something I'm finding interesting about that culture, or the story itself has something going on that's relatively, something new there compared to what I read before. So yeah, I mean, clearly people who are like native speakers or people who are editing these kind of texts in English may have a different perspective. So that is something that I learned along the way, and I don't I'm still not convinced if that is the right way. But like editors and publishers know better than like a random hobby translator like me. So I leave it to them usually.
I am curious, since you gave this example, how did you bridge that language gap? Like when you said you translated from Telugu to English and it felt very monotonous, everything started with I. So then what did you do? Did you leave it like that? Did you modify it?
So I think I don't have a clear process on approaching those things. I mean, I like to think I go with the flow. So of course you try to rewrite a few things, and then for some things you need to also think, right? Like, do you need to literally translate this, or should you just leave the idiom as is? And it may look strange in English, but it's okay. Like people will figure it out. Or for some of these things, like in one of the stories I translated earlier, not Bharati's, but an individual story, not a book. The author comes from a tribal background, and he talks about how the different kinds of fruits they find, how they use the different kind of fruits they find, and things like that. And I have never heard of what those fruits are. I mean, as a native Telugu speaker, I never heard those names. And when I asked him, he said, "I don't know what they're called in English." So, so in those kind of things, like I mean, I'm okay with, like, as a reader, I'm comfortable with reading some strange words and inferring from the context. And if I'm really curious, I need to point that fruit to an English one. Then maybe I look at some, like ask some Google or something and try to find out. But those things ideally don't break the flow, in my view. And I mean, it's not very uncommon, right? Like when you're reading novels from or stories from other countries, or like say you pick up an African author or something, they like they use some of these their native words freely in the middle, right? Like, and it's not like an academic text. You don't put detailed footnotes for everything, like every usage saying this is how it is and this person used it first, and all these things. You're reading as a regular reader, not as an academic, and you're just fine. So so I think it's okay. Like, I mean, I think in my view, it's okay to have some kind of semi-odd constructions once in a while, because that is, you are translating from a different culture, so it should not read like as if you're just reading English text, I don't know, deculturizing everything.
No, that's really beautiful. And I'll be honest, I hadn't thought of it like that. In my mind, translation had to be this really step by step perfect thing. But I think that's the beauty of how you're thinking of translation, that it's meant to serve the original story. And sometimes that means it will not make, it will not meet all the rules of English, but it doesn't have to because it was written in Telugu. I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, I think I think it's because I don't have that trained background in literature or anything, right? I'm thinking more like a reader, and if I'm okay with it as a reader, I'm fine with it as a translator.
I think that's why your work has the reach it does. I think readers are smart and readers know what they like. And if text can really reach that audience, that should be the power of translation. So somewhere we spoke a bit about, how language translates. But there's more to the characters, especially I think when you were translating The Hunger That Moved a Goddess. I'm curious, how did you approach capturing the protagonist's voice? Because the protagonist was a woman who was navigating faith, desire, social expectations. So, what were the challenges in preserving that interiority, right? Like her identity, her character across language?
Um, so these stories, like in some stories, protagonist is also a child, right? Like in some of the stories are also told from a child's perspective. So there is the story about the rice that was given at a dead man's funeral or something, where she talks about like she gets so that there is this house where somebody is dead, like a rich man's house where somebody is dead, and they're donating like food to all the poorer sections of the village. And this girl goes there because her father is not feeding the family, her mother is sick, and they have to eat something. And she gets back the rice and millets or whatever they give there, and then the father is like shocked, like how can you make food with this is not supposed to be for food. And this girl is really afraid, like she doesn't know what to do, and then she goes asks a elderly woman in the neighborhood, and then the woman of course has an adult perspective, and she's like, if these men are not feeding the family, they like, what is the point in saying, you can't feed with this food? Anything that satisfies your hunger is, food. So I think so with these stories, like I think the author herself took care of these things, right? Like many different perspectives come in the stories itself. Like there is a child's perspective, there is a like more elderly person's perspective, there is a woman's perspective. I didn't find it like, and the language is also more direct, which could be because the author also like the stories come from her own experiences with people in her village, right? Like, I mean, I'm not saying the exact same experiences, but the stories are inspired by her own life. It's not like it's not, they are not written keeping, I want to write in this kind of flowery literary language or with this kind of strong narrative technique or something like that. So it's a more natural flow. So I think it's easier to bring those kind of stories into another language compared to other issues you may face with more style focused or I don't know, focused on more like literary aspects.
I found that part really interesting where you said, the author preserves that perspective. And the author sort of lays the narrative for how you will translate. And I'm thinking of that in terms of feminist writing because a lot of your translations are feminist. Um, they tend to play with language in a certain way. They use silence meaningfully. They try to change traditional forms, reclaim certain words as well. So, how do you preserve these like literary strategies when the target language might have a completely different way of addressing this, right? Is it something unique to feminist literature for you?
I actually don't know. I mean, I happened to translate these two books into English by chance, and it was not intentional picking up women writers who are writing on certain topics. But like I said about cultural translation before, intercultural translation before, when we are not looking to confine ourselves to the typical syntax of English language or the typical kind of idioms of English language, and we are relatively more open to experiment a little bit with the language there. Uh, these things that you talk about, like the stylistic aspects of how these writers are using words and things like that, I think they will naturally flow into the translation. I mean, again, like I said, I'm not
Mhm.
a professional translator or a literary person, so or a feminist. Like I'm not very familiar with feminist literature, also, other than very basic things that you come across. So yeah, may sound very naive, not very like, but yeah,
Which
that's
says
how I
that
see it.
I think you're definitely a professional translator. Maybe, I think we need to change the idea of what it means to be a professional translator because you've done such brilliant work. Yeah, I just want to say that.
Thank you. I mean, it so happens. So I'm currently working on a translation. It so happens that that's also a woman author, but that was not intentional. It just happened like that.
I think you're subconsciously picking those, and it's better for the rest of us. Um, I'm curious about the other part of your work also, right? Like you've noted in your work that there's an importance to developing computational resources for Indian languages. And from a literary point of view, what does it mean? When certain languages have more translation infrastructure, how does it, did it make your job easier or tougher? And does it impact like how much these stories reach a global audience?
um, yeah, like I mean, we don't like. compared to like a few years ago, there is like say translation from Telugu to English, machine translation has improved a lot. But when I say improved a lot, it's also more in the context of like this news and these kind of things, right? And there are both good and bad to that. Like in one way, you're able to like there are many people who are interested in the Telugu world but can't read Telugu. Like say people who are growing up abroad for Telugu parents or something like that. You are interested in Telugu culture, but you don't know how to read. And translation definitely makes those kind like it more accessible for those kind of things, right? But there are also some problems. Like you see some websites, some news websites or something. You read the language there, or you see an advertisement board on the road, and it's clear they use machine translation. They're not talking to human beings. It's like it reads odd, and sometimes even the spellings in Telugu are not proper. So you see it all the time. Like I mean, there are many memes in Telugu online groups about these kind of things. Like can't they just talk to a person? So there are both good and bad, but I would prefer to look at the more positive side and what it can do, even for literary translators. Like I've talked about this before, and I also wrote about it before on how I think, say, these large language models or general machine translation systems can benefit translators in terms of choice of words or just sampling a few different paraphrases of what you wrote and brainstorming a little bit on what may look better in a given context and things like that. It's not, I mean, you can surely say, okay, fine, why don't you talk to a human? Maybe it'll be much better. But translation is in some ways a very lonely job until you go into that editing phase, right? Like, who is going to be interested in whether you're translating a sentence literally or in a more flowery language or in whatever language? Like, who is going to talk to you? So, I think, like, in that phase, it may be useful to use some kind of machine translation system or something just to get a sense of how things may look different from how you think. Say for example, I used dictionaries a lot, English to Telugu and Telugu to English, just to see like are there any other words that I can use in this place. Or sometimes like in some like especially with Bharati's stories, because she comes from a very different regional uh, background as from me. Although we both speak Telugu, there are some words which I would say differently. So even a Telugu to the Telugu dictionary is useful in those cases, right? So all these are like computational resources. Like I didn't use any paper-based stuff. So I think there is a role for technology when you're even when you're doing literary translation. It's not like I don't think we'll be at this point where uh, we don't need translators at all and machines will translate everything. I mean, if we reach that phase, maybe machines only will read everything. So we don't have to read anything.
I love that. In fact, you've already gone into my next question. And it's one I think everyone's really curious about right now, which is given that your research involves developing large language models for Indian languages and AI translation tools have become much more sophisticated, right, than they used to be. So, what's exciting about this and what is concerning for you? Since you know you're traversing both sides, the tech side and the translation side.
So from the tech side, I'm excited by the possibilities now. Like say, for example, the spelling checking and grammar checking and these kind of things, basic things that have been available for like I don't know ever since I was a student for English. You still don't have those kind of things for many Indian languages. I don't know even if Hindi has something reliable, being the more widely spoken language in India. So when you look at this the recent developments in AI, like this large language models and things like that, I think that entry barrier, like building that very first solution, became much easier, at least for our languages. I'm not saying if you pick some remote tribal language spoken by hardly 1,000 people in India, or like say a language from Andaman or something, and then say you want to develop a machine translation system for it. I don't think that got any better. You still need you know some dedicated resource there. But if you're looking at these languages that are relatively widely spread on internet, a lot of speakers, a lot of content being produced every day, you don't have to develop something from scratch. You can start with some existing like a chat gpt or something like that and build from there. It won't be like 100% efficient or whatever, but going from 0 to 1 has gotten much easier in terms of developing this basic computational tools for some of the languages at least. So that's I think a more positive side. And I think there is a lot of scope in that area, like to go further. And there are a lot of universities and other groups in India. Even government of India seems to be very interested in those kind of things these days, like doing these Indian language specific models and things like that. So that's a more positive side, which I think is good. And there may be a lot of end applications eventually. Like there may be a time where we can converse, like different people from different backgrounds in India can converse in their own languages and get support from different government bodies and things like that. On the flip side, like this issue that I mentioned about, where you see these machine translated text or ads or whatever trying to reach global customers, but without actually having any language expert or anybody. So I don't know what purpose that serves, and it's possible that people may think this is real and this is how it is, and there is always a possibility of these mistranslations and things like that, and misinformation, obviously, and it goes into that rabbit hole from there. So there are all those negative aspects, and of course, in terms of creativity itself, like producing like these images from AI or like writing AI based short stories or something like that, there is a lot of understandable negativity from people who actually like writers and poets and more creative people, right? I i mean i personally think this is inevitable. I mean, it's already there. You can't live in denial about it. It's already there, and if you're not doing it, somebody else will do it. So I think some kind of balance uh, in like as a writer or as a translator for me is to learn how to use these tools and understand where it is relevant for you, where it is useful for you, but don't give away your soul to the to the tools, which won't happen. Like if you're a writer or if you're a creative person, you'll figure out some ways to be creative even with the help of those models.
I think I really enjoy the fact that you started by positioning how this could be a good thing. Like I've seen these tools really democratize access. Like there are so many workshops or trainings we'll do where there are 20 people in the room who speak 4 languages. And
Yeah,
sometimes, given our non-profit structures, there aren't the resources to have 4 interpreters in the room or have 4 facilitators. But having tools like this means everyone can actually talk and everyone can contribute. So I think there have been some fantastic value adds. But you also touched upon some of the things that I am curious about from the concern part, to be honest. Um, so I bring up two. I think one is that, there is this thing that, of course, AI tools will make it much cheaper and faster to do this. So, is there the possibility that it will flatten the art of translation? Or do you think that is something that will remain? I think you said that for creative workers, right? They'll always find a way to be creative.
yeah.
What does this mean for translation?
Like what kind of translation do you? I mean, translation is also a creative endeavor, right? Like it depends on what you're doing.
100%, yeah. So within that creative field, like given that tools will be faster, cheaper, what does that mean for the future of translation?
So I think it depends on the genre of translation. So maybe if you're doing like this like news translation and these kind of things, which are like more of a routine nature, in the sense that there is less scope for uh, creative expression within that space of sticking to the original, maybe there will be more automation, especially also because like in these fields translators are paid by the word, right? So if you're using machine translation, maybe they get paid much less, so there is incentive for those people who are hiring the translators. But I don't know if that will come to more literary translations, like say poetry or a short story or a novel, because ultimately you want people to buy these books and read them and talk about them, right? And if you're completely relying on say a machine translated text or something, and I mean, I don't know how, like I've known people use not translation, but uh, computational tools for helping with their novel writing, or I've spoken to authors of who do this kind of thing, and it's still like there is a lot of human creative effort involved, right? Like, I mean, where do the ideas come from? These ideas come from our own lived experience, and a large language model, although it sees like 1,000 different lives, is not a living entity. and it won't experience these emotions on a daily basis, and meet people on a daily basis and things like that, right? So
Mm,
I don't think this will, like, we'll reach that point where there is a complete
mm.
switch from, like, you won't see writers anymore or something like that. But then, I mean, what do I know? 5 years back, who would have predicted it is like this?
Um, but what you touched upon is so powerful because it really speaks to there's an element of like cultural nuance and artistry that are perhaps the limitations of these machine learning AI models, where easy text is okay, but there is so much value that translators bring in through context, through nuance. I think you mentioned that, your curiosity drove you to trying to understand the fruits, trying to understand what was mentioned in those texts. And that adds so much, I think, flavor to literature, which would otherwise be missing. So, from that point of view, I'd also like to understand from you that if someone had to read more literature, be it in Telugu, South Indian languages, um, but they could only do it like by relying on machine learning. Like, for example, I want to read a poem, but I can only do it if I run it through like a Perplexity or ChatGPT. What do you think I should keep in mind? Like, what am I missing when I do that?
Two things: you can never guarantee 100% accuracy with whatever you use, even in a very simple kind of thing. If you still see a lot of people, putting up these screenshots online where even simple things like, count the number of hours in a strawberry, and then ChatGPT gets it wrong and things like that. I don't think we'll be ever free from this kind of situation. Maybe not that particular question, but something else. Like, I think just purely relying on something to look at, uh, either literary or non-literary translation, just purely relying on machine translation, never guarantees this kind of accuracy. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I mean, you probably, it may not read very fluently, like in a literary way, like, because you're still like these language models and all are still more statistical in nature. They're still trying to look at what is the most likely next word, given this previous set of words. But creative text is not like that, right? Like, I mean, if you're just writing in a very predictable manner, who reads you? Why should anyone read you? So I think that's also another thing that people should keep in mind when they're reading in translation. I mean, I'm saying, like, it's okay, like, you don't have any option, you saw some text and you're really curious to know what it is, you want to put it in some Google Translate or something, but just keep these things in mind. Like, it may never be completely accurate, and the creative flow of the language, original language, may not be really reflected in the when you're reading it in, say, in English, because these machines by default work in a more on a probabilistic or statistical manner, and tends to generate what is more commonly possible than what is more creative. It's not impossible to generate like text that looks more exotic or whatever with the
Mm.
machines, but it can also go too exotic to follow. So yeah, I think that's what people should keep in mind.
I love that. And that's something I'm going to keep in mind as well. But at the beginning, you mentioned that, you're translating one other book, but it's a woman author again. And you don't know how that happened. So I think that's where I'm also, where my mind is going. Who gets to be a translator also matters. Like, how does your identity, you speak Telugu fluently, you have a sense of Telugu literary culture, but you also have a background in computational linguistics, right? How does all of this come together to determine what choices you're making when you choose? Like, how do you pick, I'm going to translate this?
So I think the fact that I'm working in this area in technology doesn't really impact what I'm picking to translate. So when I'm looking at things that I want to translate, typically from Telugu to English, at least typically what I'm looking at is this something that is not seen in English literature usually. Like, if someone like this, like Bharti stories, for example, like, she comes from a very specific like community background, like a Dalit background, and from a village, and she talks about women's lives. It's not about any Dalit life, but talks about women's life from the perspective of women. And most of the stories are like in the same vein, right? Like, there are um, some men are, like, say, irresponsible, not taking care of the family, and then there are some people who are like, burdened by the responsibilities of the family. And there is happiness, there is sadness, everything. Like I look for more diverse emotions. Like, I mean, I'm not particularly interested in stories that talk about, say, some kind of oppression or some kind of desire for violence, or like a more extreme emotion, or where everybody is a good person and everything is like the world is a beautiful place. I'm not interested in those kind of stories also. Like, I'm looking for stories that bring some kind of regional cultural lived experiences. Like, say, in Bharati stories, she also talks a lot about those festivals that they do, which are not like, she talks about this festival for honoring the elders, which is not exactly, I mean, you do those kind of festivals in all areas of India probably, or in many cultures in the world, but the exact traditions that they follow may be, different, right? Like, there was one story where this woman talks about how she's hoarding stuff, like saying how she's packing the tamarind into a big box so that it will last for 6 months or something like that. And when you read those kind of things, there are things like, what kind of things are people doing to survive, right? And she's not talking about it like, this is a sad thing and this is our sad life or whatever. Like, it's also a celebration of their own life and their own identity. So I think those are the kind of things I look for when I'm translating, not really in terms of any technical stuff.
I have to say that, I love the joy on your face when you're talking about this is how I choose what to translate. And it's so important, I think, increasingly in a world that feels very polarized, to be able to like work with stories that are great. Not everyone's great. Not like, there's no clear villain and clear hero. Just like the nuances of everyday life, which are not so black and white. Of
Yeah.
course, from a reader, like from my point of view, that's more interesting. But also, I think just from the political space the world is in, I think that's very needed as well, right?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say, like, there should be space for everything, right? I mean, this is how I see it. Like, there may be somebody who wants to only focus on, I don't know, some specific aspect, like some community or some ideology or something like that. It's up to them. I mean, if as long as they're able to find somebody who is invested in publishing it and people who are buying and reading it, I think it's okay. People have different ideologies. Sometimes we may not agree with them, but they're already there.
Oh, 100%. I think I went through a whole phase when all I wanted to do was read something that has a happy ending. And now I feel back at that stage where I want complexity. So I think just that,
Yeah.
uh, and being able to hold space for both of that is really lovely. And you mentioned that, as long as you find someone who's interested in doing this. So that's my next question is, when publishers are picking, okay, which book do we translate? How do they make these decisions? What influences that? And do you think like, you know, regional Indian texts tend to be at a bit of a disadvantage globally when it comes to this?
So I have to say, I don't have experience with approaching publishers myself. In all the cases I translated, somebody took care of that part. I'm fortunate about that. But that said, I do think there may be a disadvantage if you're looking to translate from these regional languages and you're picking stories like, say, like these Bharti stories or something like that, and approaching, like, if I say I bring these stories and approach some publisher in Canada, say, for example, there are two kinds of disadvantages in my view. First thing, these writers are not some kind of literary gurus or something like that. They're writing in a more natural flowing text that you know they talk about, or they people around them talk about, which may not read very well for someone who is not open to all sorts of writing. Second thing, these people are not very well known sometimes, even within like, it's not like some Hindi writer comes and says, okay, I'm translating this author, and then, oh, I know that author, I heard about him. It's not that, like, that's not going to happen for at least these kind of stories or authors that I'm interested in. So obviously, when you go with these kind of and also, like, for me also, I also have the disadvantage that I am not a very great uh, writer in English as well. I will need a lot of support with editing and things like that. uh, so I think there are all sorts of issues of this kind when you approach a publisher with these kind of what I perceive as relatively non famous kind of stories. and you decide to translate them. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, people have to, I mean, that's how it is. Like, we don't know what to do. Like, I mean, people can self-publish, of course, but maybe they won't have the same reach as going through some actual
Hmm.
publisher.
No, it is a challenge that's existed for a while. Like I know that now with the creator economy, it's positioned more as a challenge that, oh, you have to be famous, you have to be viral. But I think there is an element of this since forever. That if you're not
Yeah,
known, if you're not going to sell your book as it comes out, then
I
the
mean, I
chance
think
the
it's
publisher will
the
take you.
same even for regular authors, right? Not even translators. Like, if you're if you're a new author and you have some kind of new idea that you think has not been explored before, that's also a problem again, right? Like, how will you convince a publisher that it is something that would interest other people? Like,
100%. I read something recently which spoke about how modern or publishing houses now want to commission books only with influencers and what a
oh,
disadvantage it is for the field of literature. But then what is the balance there, right? Like a lot of indie publishing houses do a great job here then in bridging that. What do you think?
yeah, I think even those things increased over time, right? Like, compared to like a few years ago, maybe it is relatively, there are some options. Like, if you're just like a so I learned about a recent Telugu book that got translated into English, a short story book. And when I was just chatting with the translator, how she went about doing this, she said, I just started uploading these drafts on publisher websites that allowed this kind of upload without an agent or something like that. It took a while, but eventually it worked out. So, be patient. So I think that probably would not have been possible 10 years ago, because you don't have those people who will just let you upload whatever you wrote without an agent representing you or something like that. So I think it's definitely better, but it is still difficult if you're going like against the typical tide and trying to do something. I'm thankful I'm not a professional person in this, and I have a job, and I don't have to worry about it.
No, but that's good insight. Like, there is the difficulty, but there's also so much more increased access to audience, which has perhaps never existed before this time. So, couple of like questions before we wrap up is, in the hunger that moved to goddess, are there some translation choices that you're very proud of, where you feel like you really captured something while translating the language that readers should look out for when they pick up the book?
I don't know. It's hard to answer this question. I mean, so I think the keeping the kinship terms as is, and uh, leaving them out. Like, I think that's a good choice that I made, uh, because that's how people in villages talk. At least in Telugu speaking areas, maybe it's common. It's like, in other areas of India as well, and that is something that you don't really see in English, right? Like, you have a lot of people from different backgrounds in India writing in English, but not these kind of things. Like, and keeping those things, I think, gave a flavor of how life looks like for these people, for English readers. So that is something I'm happy that I did, and I'm also happy the editors agreed with this. Like, there was a lot of refinement of the draft that happened after I gave it to them, but some of these things remained. Like, I mean, if they said something like, we should not do like this is not good translation, there is nothing I could have done. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, so I'm happy that those things are retained in the translation, and I see some people writing about these things on social media, on Instagram, and they mention these things, like, this keeping of these words intact. It's good, like, they liked it. So I'm happy that that happened, and I did my part.
No, I love that. I think it retains the flavor of relationships very differently and really preserves and honors that. And a good keynote for translators is you do need a, supportive editor and publisher. People who get what you're trying to do when you do this. Mm,
Yeah.
I'm also curious because, it's lovely to have someone who's a technologist and a translator. So, what do you think is the future of cross linguistic literary exchanges? Like, what gives you more hope about diverse voices reaching global readers? Have you seen that with your work? Like, if your work has reached an audience that it had not reached before, any stories, any experiences?
So I share this work with my friends and colleagues here in Canada, and not everybody is of Indian origin, of course. In fact, like while doing this, while translating some of these stories, I gave it to one of my colleague. He's like a French Canadian, and they didn't find anything strange or anything about the stories, and seemed to think these are good stories. So that also gave me more confidence that it may look strange, it may look odd, like why did you choose this author instead of all the other famous authors, but it will be fine. So, and again, like I said, like a publisher, editor who really trusts you and agrees with you on this is very important.
Yeah.
And I'm glad Geeta Ramaswamy Garu and Southside Books were those people for me.
Well, that's really powerful. I think there's also so much just power in things feeling normal, rather than feeling special or feeling different. Because I think that's when it starts getting normalized and accepted, right? So I think that that's really good to know and good to hear as well.
Yeah, it's not like it's me just thinking it's a school and I'm translating, but there are actually people who do not have any of this background reading it and still thinking this is interesting, and that's what you want from a reader, right? Like, I mean, you don't like the purpose of these kind of books, in my view, is not just sitting in some literary journals or
Mhm.
literature departments, right? Like normal people, like my neighbor or my
Yeah.
somebody I meet on the road should be able to just read these books and think, okay, there are these kind of things. I never knew about that. I
Yeah.
mean, the, I don't know, just like I am reading stories about people, random people I will never meet and cultures that I will never see, and I'm thinking, oh, this is cool, they have this thing. I want people to feel like that about these stories.
No, that's beautiful. And I think that is the power of literature. And given, the work at Sanskaari Girls Book Club, I think it's so fundamental to us that we make South Asian literature one more accessible and read by global audiences. But at the same time, we just make it normal. We make it normal to pick up one of these books, to be able to understand it, to be able to speak about it, and to be able to like work through the text together because it's such a beautiful form of education to be able to read and understand and learn. It really allows you both a very deeply private experience and having a book club or a space where you discuss it also lets you reflect with people. So I love what you said about books are not meant for libraries. Books are meant to be read, to be shared, to be felt and experienced. Yeah, I think that's a really lovely
Yes,
thought. Thank
I mean, everybody has a story, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it needs to be heard. Whether
Yeah.
you hears it or somebody else who are more in tune with the author hears it is a different question. But there should be some way in which they can be heard. So that's how I view it. Like it doesn't, like, I mean, I one of the author I really wanted to translate but did not manage to so far. I translated a few stories. I want to do more. Is this Savara, like indigenous author that I talked about, this tribal author that I talked about. His name is Malipuram Jagadish, and he's really the one who got me back into translation in a way. Like after Koteswarama's book, and I did not do anything for many years. And I want other people to feel, this kind of thing. Like, I want to talk about this author. This author has to be read in by other people. So I don't know when if I'll do a translation again, but yeah, that is my
Mhm.
general view on these kind of things.
No, that I'm going to take that away from today, right? Like that everyone has a story and that every story has its own listeners. It may not be for you, but it is for someone. And I know you said, maybe you'll translate. I'm really counting on you translating more, going ahead. No pressure. We always end with like this one question to people who come on board is what are some authors, especially in your case, Telugu authors, feminist authors, that you think deserve translation? Whose voices are we still missing in English? You already mentioned one, but are there others?
Um, so my view of most of the Telugu to English translation, is that it is driven by some kind of ideology. It can be feminism, it can be communism, it can be whatever. But I think we should focus more on not on ideology alone, but on whether this is something that people have never read before in English and whether it will interest them. And that will not restrict you to say, I mean, what's a feminist? Like, it depends. Like, it's a broad definition, right? You can have a very extreme definition of feminist, or you can have a more general definition which covers like say women writing about lives of women, about people around them, about language that only a woman can use, and things like that. So I think like most of the Telugu authors that we saw in English translation so far represent a very limited kind of thought process within Telugu literature, which is broad. It has centuries old history. Like there are many like classical women poets as well as writers over the centuries, like who are over the decades, who are like who come from say more traditional background, like and you start working and you have a family, and then you have these daily issues that you face between like that clash between domestic life and office and these professional commitments and these kind of things. Like I think those kind of writers need to come more into English from all languages, not just Telugu, because those are our like some of those problems you still see, right? Like I mean, I when I talk to my friends, like other friends who are having full time jobs and who are trying to manage families and kids, sometimes we still like I wonder, like these things. I'm living in a different country in a different generation, but these things still seem to be something that my mom or my grandmother's generation faced and things like that. I think those kind of stories from like there are, I mean, I don't want to take specific names. Like there are authors from 70s like or 60s. Like there is a somebody like Ilindala Saraswati Devi whom I read very little of her, but I really like what she wrote. And she's like, I don't know, she had her centenary year must have been like a few years ago. She's from a different generation. And I was talking to a friend about like what do you really want to see from Telugu to English, and she suggested a writer called Kalyana Sundari Jagannath. She wrote like I read a few stories of her, and ideologically you won't find anything interesting in them, but it's just about like how she describes things and how she builds up the story and things like that. That those are the things that you talk the Telugu critics talk about when you read her stories, and the stories are all set in a very local. Uh, Regional environment. Of course, you will still say it's not representative. It's very specific community or something like that. But everything is specific to that community. Like if you're writing about your own people and your own experiences, it will be specific. The feelings it will evoke in a reader may be more general, more universal, but without giving those specific details. Like if I'm reading a Dalit writer, I would expect to see more about their culture, like their festivals. How do they do? What do they do at home? What are the kind of things they face? If I'm reading, say, a writer who comes from a very traditional Brahmin community, I would expect the same thing. Like I would expect to see like what they're talking about, their cultural practices, or and they'll be very different. Like there is no way in which they'll all converge into some kind of more generic, bland thing like a large language model does about. Like we are humans, right? So I think all like I mean my point is like all kinds of authors like this need to come into English, which I think is not the case right now.
Hmm. No, that's a really useful and powerful reflection for us to close with as well, to think about why all stories must be translated and must be heard and engaged with. Because critique, engagement, reflection requires first to know and to engage and to read. And I think that's a really lovely way to think about it. And also that people write from a place of what they know, right? And once they write, then it is our job to reflect and to engage with it, to push back even where required.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's how we'll know, right? Like I mean, there may be something fundamentally flawed with our own ideology, and
Yeah.
we won't figure it out if we are only reading stories of that kind, right? If
Hmm.
we read something very different and suddenly it questions some of our fundamental beliefs, and
Yeah.
then we start thinking, and we may change our ideology, we may not. That's a different thing.
100%. No, 100%. Thank you for that, Soumya. Before we close, any final thoughts? I have learned so much about the politics and the process of translation today, and that's really something I'm taking with me. Anything you want to share with our listeners before we close?
Um, I would just say, be more open minded when you're reading translations from other languages and cultures.
Yeah,
So that open mindedness is needed in all aspects of life in general, and reading is not an exception.
I love that. A thread that's emerged for me today is to not reject without knowing and to not
Yeah.
stop engaging, like to constantly learn, engage, explore. And it's fascinating to me that this has come up in a conversation about translation and in a conversation about AI and translation, right? Which really speaks to the power of translation to bridge those barriers and to say, look, you have to listen first to be able to do anything else. So thank you so much for today. This has been the Sanskaari Girls Podcast. I'm Vandita, and a big reminder to everybody to follow us on Instagram, sign up for a membership, it's free, and also subscribe to our newsletter. Sowmya, thank you so much. As I've said many times now, I've left away with insights that I had not expected coming into this conversation. And I'm sure we have listeners curious about translation, and maybe even potential budding translators who are going to take away a lot from this. We'll be sharing Soumya's work when we share the podcast links as well. I also want to give a big shout out to Anjali on production and scripting, as well as Kuhu on overall coordination and support. As always, please keep reading, writing, and finding new ways to make your voice heard through the written word. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.